From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Donald Trump raises millions more on his guilty verdict in New York as Republican lawmakers return to Washington with retribution plans. We follow the money and the messaging with pollster Frank Luntz.
Israel pushes back on the ceasefire proposal revealed last week by President Biden. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu refusing to endorse a permanent stop in fighting until Hamas is destroyed. We'll discuss with Carmiel Arbit of the Atlantic Council.
And Claudia Sheinbaum is elected Mexico's first female president in a landslide victory, with her coalition just nearly missing a supermajority in the legislature. We'll explore what it means for U.S.-Mexico relations. So certainly, Joe, this evening we have our eyes on many stories abroad, but the stories here at home continue to be dominated by one thing, and that is last week's guilty verdict of former President Donald Trump. Yeah,
that's for sure. Certainly as lawmakers return to Washington from their Memorial Day recess, it takes on new meaning here in the Capitol. And an interview that the former president sat for over the weekend advances the story as he considers out loud the possibility of being sentenced to jail. Here he is on Fox.
The judge could decide to say, hey, house arrest or even jail.
It could.
How do you face what that could look
I'm okay with it. I saw one of my lawyers the other day on television saying, oh, no, you don't want to do that to the president. I said, you don't beg for anything. You just, the way it is. So that could happen. I don't know that the public would stand it, I'm not sure the public would stand for it. At a certain point, there's a breaking point.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Eric Larson, who's a legal reporter for us. So, Eric, how much of the odds of Trump actually spending time behind bars depends on his conduct between now and July 11th when he's actually sentenced?
Sure, that's a really great question, because even before the trial started, we were speaking with legal experts who said that while they thought it was unlikely that Trump would be spending any time behind bars if he were convicted, that a lot really does depend on how a defendant behaves after they are found guilty. We've seen plenty of cases before where a defendant has admitted some sort of wrongdoing, taken some responsibility, and that has helped the outlook for a sentence. Not only is Trump not taking any responsibility for the verdict, he's, of course, going on the attack, and as we've seen over the weekend. So it really is going to be interesting to see how much time the DA suggests, if any, in his sentencing recommendation, and what the judge actually comes down with at the sentencing on July 11th.
We should remind our viewers and listeners that Eric was actually in the courthouse for the bulk of this trial. And you were just great, Eric, your team transmitting real-time information for us in a world without cameras and microphones. But procedurally, I'm compelled by the next step, and I believe that's an interview that the former president of the United States will have with a probation officer. How's that going to work?
Yeah, this is a really standard procedure where a defendant who has been convicted has to meet with these probation individuals and just sort of try to give a sense of who they are as a person, what kind of risks they might face if they are flight risks, that sort of thing. It's something that is very secret. It's not something we're ever expecting to see. So really, the biggest public documents that we can expect to come out of this might be the recommendations from the DA and perhaps from the defense. But I'd tell you, it would be really fascinating to be a fly on the wall in one of these interviews, because it's going to be something that Trump has certainly never experienced before.
Yeah, I think we would all love to be a fly on the wall in that room, Eric. Of course, we've paid a lot of attention over the course of the last several weeks to this trial in particular, but a new trial with political implications began today in Delaware. President's son, Hunter Biden, on trial for 3 gun-related crimes, essentially buying a firearm and lying about his addiction to crack cocaine. At least those are the allegations. The jury was selected today. We understand that the opening statements will be tomorrow. How difficult is this case for the president's son and his defense team?
It does seem like a fairly difficult case, only because I'll point out that some of the biggest evidence that the government has against Hunter Biden came from, his own book. He sort of admitted out there in public that he was addicted to drugs at the time that he got this firearm. So that being said, his lawyers do have a defense plan here. They're planning to argue that technically speaking, perhaps Biden was not actually addicted or high at the moment that he bought the weapon, and that perhaps there's a distinction there, and that some of the laws around this particular law are too vague to be applied in this specific way. So the lawyers have come up with some theories to get around this. Potentially, it's, of course, going to be up to this jury. But some of that evidence, like I said, comes straight from Hunter Biden's own book.
Eric, there was a plea deal, of course, in this case, and it played out in the public eye as it completely fell apart. But it did not include prison time. And I wonder if that plea deal gives us any sense of how this case might resolve.
We never got to that stage, so it's unclear. But it's also worth pointing out that there is a separate case, a tax-related case that Hunter Biden faces from the same special counsel that was brought in California, a federal court, that is going on trial in September. So, even if Hunter Biden is convicted, he's still going to face this other trial. And even if he's acquitted, he'll face this other trial. So it really is an unprecedented situation that he is facing here.
Mm-hmm. Eric, it's great to have you back in the Bureau. Bloomberg's Eric Larson, having lived through the trial in Lower Manhattan, with us on Balance of Power. For more on the ongoing fallout from former President Trump's conviction, we bring in Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsin. It's great to see you at the table. As always, Saleha, lawmakers are coming back to Washington now. So this is kind of the next leg in the story as we go from the legal aspect to the political one, not only on the campaign trail, but resonating here in Washington. The big headline today, though, seems to be the money. We're at, what was it, $52 million, if my memory is correct, up from 38 million or 34 million, rather, at the end of last week. This is just tens of millions of dollars continue to come in, small donations, and in many cases, new donors. What are we learning about Donald Trump's chances through the money?
Yeah, a quarter of those are new donors. We're seeing small cash amounts coming in, showing that people who don't have a ton of money, don't have millions or thousands to give, still want to participate in democracy in this way. The interesting thing is that we didn't actually learn anything new about Trump and his history in the run-up to the 2016 election from the trial. So I don't know if the money that's coming in, if that signifies a sigh of relief of like, this person didn't completely get sort of thrown overboard by the trial. It's not as bad as we expected. Or if it kind of was like, okay, well, we've crossed that Rubicon. He's convicted, but he's still standing there and conventions are coming up. A debate is coming up. We're going to put our money there.
Or perhaps the fact that he was convicted provides more evidence to some that this is all rigged against him, and therefore they want to lend his money to support. It's remarkable, though, the figures that we're considering. The Trump campaign, together with the RNC, says they raised $141 million in May. And Saleha, we've been talking so much about this cash gap between Trump and Biden, that Trump has been having to play catch up. With figures like this, knowing we haven't heard from the Biden campaign yet, it potentially is a gap that is all but closed.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what have we been saying for the last couple of months? That the polls show that Trump is edging ahead, but the money is showing that Biden's winning. But if we're going to use those same metrics right now, Biden is winning on both counts. So maybe the sitting president is an underdog right now. Senator
Mike Lee says he's going to slow things down in the Senate, gum up the works here, keep Biden initiatives from progressing, all in the name of retribution for Donald Trump. Judicial nominations will be on ice, for instance. So I guess the store is closed in more ways than one on Capitol Hill now. Absolutely. They're looking to gum up legislation in all parts of Washington right now to kind of show that, hey, they think that the progressives or Democrats were putting their thumb on the scale for the Trump verdict or the timing of that trial, and also kind of show a judge how things are playing out, right? I mean, if you're a judge on this case and you're seeing public outcry, I don't know. I would think you're a human being. It's going to affect how you rule. They're supposed to be more pristine than the rest of us. So I don't know if it's going to influence his thinking. Yeah, and of course, we'll see how it actually influences legislative business on Capitol Hill. Even if they aren't doing much legislating next week, though, we do now have a date
for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, giving a joint address to Congress. It'll be next week, June 13th. Biden will actually be at the G7. He won't even be in town. But Netanyahu and Joe Biden seems that they've gotten their wires crossed potentially in recent days. Joe Biden with a big speech Friday saying we have this 3-phase plan that Israel has agreed to. We just need Hamas to sign on. And then Netanyahu seeming to say not so fast. Not all of this is as you characterized it. What's going on?
Absolutely, Kaylee. It's been a little hard to figure out what is White House spin and U.S. administration spin versus what is Hamas saying and what is Benjamin Netanyahu saying. It does look, Biden officials have said that this was kind of Hamas's plan that they proposed, that Israel turned down a few weeks back, and we have added some new brushstrokes to it and proposed it again. And it doesn't, and they did give Netanyahu a couple of hours notice that this speech is coming, and here are the brass tacks of it. And now we're seeing that Netanyahu is expressing a little bit of surprise and pushing back on that deal.
I guess perhaps we'll get some more color when he addresses Congress.
Well, that's right.
Next week.
And will not be apparently visiting the White House. Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsen, we thank you, as always, for being with us.
All right, coming up, a slew of polls since Trump's conviction offer a variety of interpretations of how voters are reacting to the developments. We'll speak with pollster Frank Luntz after the break. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Before the conviction, the numbers I saw were in the low 20s in the African-American community. That is a huge change. And it's one of the reasons Trump, who definitely lost votes because of this conviction, he lost what we refer to as these white suburban housewives in the Midwest. There's no question. But the reason you're not seeing him go down in any of the real polling data is that he seems to be making it up someplace else.
That was former acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney on the earlier edition of Balance of Power today. Let's go now to pollster Frank Luntz with more. So, Frank, in the days since Trump's guilty verdict, we have seen a number of polls come out. You can kind of pick your poison. Each one might make you feel a bit differently. Is it actually just too soon to know what the impact of this verdict really is on the 2024 presidential outcome?
No, it's soon enough to know that it's not going to significantly alter the results at this moment. Then, in fact, the two presidential debates are going to be more important, that the gains that Trump had made among union members, Hispanics, young African-American men are significant and they're holding, that Biden's gains among middle-aged female suburban voters, those are holding. And basically, this feels more like World War I. That is just simply a ground game. It's a war of attrition. And there simply isn't that big dramatic event that most people had expected if Donald Trump was and has been found guilty on all charges. And that's what I need to emphasize. The assumption was 90 days ago that if Donald Trump was found guilty, the bottom would drop out of his support. And that has not happened. He has weakened. People have started to reconsider whether or not they support him. But there's been no dramatic shift. And that in itself is a very big story.
I wonder what you think, speaking of big stories, and something we discussed earlier in that conversation with Mick Mulvaney about this migration from Joe Biden to Donald Trump when it comes to some black voters, and from what we're understanding by polls, in many cases, older male black voters. The logic, though, Frank, has been kind of thin for me. You're a student of history and an intellectual. Are we to believe that a conviction in this case and Donald Trump selling sneakers somehow moves black voters as a monolith?
No, the selling of sneakers, I don't know who came up with the idea. I think it was Trump himself, and it's ridiculous. And actually the young, and we don't have it among older black men, we have it among younger black men who appreciate Trump's attitude, that he's a baller, that he's tough, that he's fighting the system. I still think that's much less significant than the Latino vote, which is 19% of the voter bloc, twice as high as the African-American vote, and among union members, which is really important in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which are the key states. I remind viewers, there are only 7 states in play. Trump is up in 4 of the 7 by 5 points or more. Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia, but he's virtually dead even in the other three, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If he wins the first four, all of them, he's got 268 electoral votes, but you need 270 to win. So for Trump to be elected, follow Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and all three of those states are too close to call.
Well, of course, we've seen President Biden spending a lot of time in those three states, Frank. And we've also seen President Biden spend a lot of time on this idea that Donald Trump is a danger to democracy, that democracy should be an issue that voters make their selection on come November. Does his conviction add more saliency to that argument, or is that not going to win out over things like the economy or the border?
Well, it does add more saliency, but it does so among Biden voters. If you're asking independents, swing voters, people who voted for Donald Trump once already, but not twice, people who voted for Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, but are concerned about Biden's reelection, inflation, and what I say is affordability, is the number one issue. Food and fuel, housing and health care. Making those more affordable is Biden's greatest weakness and Trump's greatest strength. The second issue is immigration, control of the border, fear of crime, fear of destabilization, and who comes across. That issue also benefits Donald Trump by about 10 points. And the third issue is abortion. And that issue is particularly important among young women. And that could be enough in these key states to bring out young women who often don't vote in presidential contests. And that issue benefits Joe Biden. You get to democracy next. It's the fourth most important, the fourth most salient issue. But let's face it, when every vote counts in these key states, I'd rather be talking about immigration and inflation over abortion and democracy.
When Joe Biden is in Normandy later this week, though, Frank, he is going to be talking about democracy. I believe you're going to be there for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. This is a moment for him. Can he leverage that to draw the contrast between his campaign and one that has been associated at times with Nazi language, the Reich post that we saw recently, not to mention just the overall tenor of these two campaigns?
That's a great question. And as I've said always, the questions that you all ask in your interviews absolutely hit the mark. One of Ronald Reagan's greatest speeches was at Pointe du Hoc. And I get emotional when I think about it because there were so many veterans that were alive then and are gone today. And Reagan used that speech to declare to the applause of Republicans, independents, and Democrats the superiority of the American system of government, the superiority of the American culture. And that's something that Joe Biden has not really been able to do. Is this a great opportunity for him? Absolutely. And the world will be watching. More importantly, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin will be watching. But still, the date that matters most in this conversation is June 27th, because that's going to be the day that decides who's going to be the next president.
The debate. Frank Luntz, it's great to have you back, and safe travels overseas. Coming up, Mexico electing its first female president in a landslide last night. We'll have a look at what this victory will mean for the country and U.S.-Mexico relations next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I also want to thank you, because for the first time in 200 years of the Republic, I will become the first female president of Mexico.
That was Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's first female president-elect. After a landslide victory on Sunday, the former mayor of Mexico City won by an expected margin of more than 30 percentage points. Imagine that in this country. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Creighton Harrison with more. Creighton, it's great to have you. We'd love to ask you about what went behind this landslide victory, but I wonder if you could just start with perspective. Mexico beat the U.S. in electing a woman to be president. How big of a deal is that for the country?
Well, it's a huge deal. I think it's a huge deal in any country, obviously. But sure. Mexico has done a lot of work to increase female representation in the political system. There's actually a little bit of a quota system that makes gender balance required in Congress, for example. We have several leaders here of government bodies, departments, even the Supreme Court, that are women. So in some ways, this was it's obviously a very hard fought and battle, and Claudia Sheinbaum deserves a lot of credit as the first. But in some ways, it was a long time coming. Mm-hmm.
So, of course, it's remarkable that any woman did this, but this woman in particular, Creighton, what do we need to know about her and the kind of policy she is likely to support? How different will it be from Mexico under AMLO?
Well, that is, you're asking the question that's on everyone's mind. So she is a protege of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the current president. She has very much stuck by his side, agrees with pretty much every policy that he has put forth. And so she has projected herself as a figure of continuity to the Mexican electorate, which clearly it likes what AMLO has had to offer over the past 6 years. So the question is, does she start to forge her own identity once she takes office? There's a lot of speculation that she may be more open, for example, to foreign investment in, not necessarily in Pemex, the state oil company, but in other forms of energy, perhaps some renewable energy, things like that. That's one opening. And then, of course, will she embrace some of the reforms that he has put forth that some people view as anti-democratic? For example, the direct election of judges, which people feel like might put the Supreme Court into a more political sphere.
Mm-hmm. We just have a minute left. Creighton, I wonder to what extent there'll be continuity then with our relations between our two countries. Joe Biden is reportedly about to drop a new executive action on the border tomorrow. Will his conversations with hers sound like the same he's had with AMLO? She made a very pointed, I think, effort last night to emphasize that she wanted good relations with the U.S. Obviously, it's Mexico's most important trade partner, and Mexico is the U.S.'s. And there's a lot of shared interests. The migration problem is something that Mexico has been working with the U.S. for quite some time. She has said she'll continue that. But obviously, with the election coming in November in the U.S., it's going to be a pretty heated political discussion in the next few months.
Absolutely. All right. Bloomberg's Creighton Harrison live from Mexico City for us tonight. Thank you so much. Now, coming up, we'll turn to other issues abroad, including Israel's reaction to the ceasefire plan that President Biden shared last week. We'll have more with Carmiel Arbit of the Atlantic Council next on Bloomberg.
The real question right now is to Hamas, right? It is Hamas that has this proposal in front of them, and Hamas that is the decision maker right now about whether it can go forward or not. But to be clear, the roadblock right now to a ceasefire is not Israel. The roadblock to a ceasefire is Hamas.
It was Matthew Miller, State Department spokesperson, earlier today talking with reporters, putting the onus on Hamas to accept the latest ceasefire proposal that Bloomberg is reporting Benjamin Netanyahu is pushing back on. Joining us now is Carmiel Arbit, Senior Fellow of Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. Carmiel, it's always our pleasure to have you. This rolled out before our eyes on Friday. We carried President Biden's remarks, a three-phased plan. We understand Netanyahu's office authorized the text of the proposal on Friday. But we're hearing a different tune here in an interview that Benjamin Netanyahu held, saying there will be no permanent ceasefire until Hamas has been eliminated. Is Joe Biden trying to force the hand of Benjamin Netanyahu publicly, or is Benjamin Netanyahu gaslighting Joe Biden?
Thanks so much for having me on. I think it's not quite as simple as gaslighting or forcing hands. The Israelis have agreed to the terms of this agreement over the course of negotiations. What still remains a question for Israel is what that timeline is going to look like and what needs to happen first in order for this ceasefire to take effect. So the Israelis are hoping to continue their operation in Rafah, to continue all of this as Hamas considers a deal. And what we're hearing from the Israeli government is they don't really expect Hamas to accept these terms. But ultimately, what Biden is doing is he is creating a narrative whereby Bibi Netanyahu has agreed to a proposal. He is now holding him accountable for it publicly and putting a huge amount of pressure on the Israeli government internally to stand by it, despite opposition from right-wing actors in Bibi's government who could potentially bring that government down.
Well, Carmiel, on that point, it was striking to see over the weekend comparisons to the threats against Benjamin Netanyahu if he were to agree to this, to essentially what we experienced here in the U.S. with the ouster of Kevin McCarthy, effectively. You do this, we give you an ultimatum, you'll be kicked out. How realistic is it that that could happen in the Israeli government as a result of this?
Yeah, Netanyahu's government has been extremely fragile. Particularly as the war has waged on, and we've seen increasing tension points between Bibi and the far-right governing coalition. And those tensions have been over both how the war is being executed, how humanitarian aid is being delivered, and who's being recruited to serve in Israel's military. So we've seen these tension points and fragility for a long time. Indeed, the far-right in Israel could bring down the government. The Likud party, Netanyahu's own party, could also bring down the government. 5 members of Likud could defect and bring it down. So we're seeing lots of tensions, and there is that concern for Netanyahu, which makes it very difficult for him to make concessions on the international front. He's under a huge amount of pressure from hostage families to secure the release of hostages, but he's also under a huge amount of pressure from the far right to make sure that Hamas is obliterated in Gaza.
Carmiel, yesterday, John Kirby, the White House National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator, was talking about this and shared that Israel was expected to say yes to the updated ceasefire plan that the president shared last week. Here he is.
We have every expectation that if Hamas agrees to the proposal, as was transmitted to them, an Israeli proposal, that Israel would say yes. Prime Minister Netanyahu's team, in fact, his foreign minister, again, just said that they welcome this this announcement by the president and that they did, in fact, agree that this was their proposal.
Yet on Saturday, Carmiel, Benjamin Netanyahu's office said, quote, Israel's conditions for ending the war have not changed, unquote. So is the truth somewhere in the middle here? We've got a 6-week pause in fighting on the table. Is that what we should be reaching for now?
Yeah, and I think the question also is how quickly these stages unfold. The idea is that a first stage, which would include a ceasefire and a withdrawal of Israeli forces, would include then negotiations for a more permanent outcome. What they have said is that a number of hostages will be released. One of the conditions that the Israelis have put forward that they have backed away from is that that would include both deceased bodies as well as living hostages. So that's a key compromise provision that we hadn't seen earlier. But at the same time, the question is what then takes us to the next phase of a more permanent ceasefire and the removal of Hamas from power. And I think that's where, again, the devil is really in the details.
I wonder how much of this will be ironed out if this will ultimately have been accepted by next week, Carmiel, when we understand Benjamin Netanyahu will be giving a joint address to a joint session of Congress. How complicated will the politics around that address be, not just here at home, but for him as he also is kind of addressing a domestic audience, too?
Absolutely. So I would not expect that his address to Congress will in any way weigh in the decision-making factor around a ceasefire agreement. I would really separate those two things. But when Netanyahu comes to Washington, he's going to be facing considerable headwinds from Democrats. The progressives are likely to boycott the speech. And he's also going to be looking at the United States on the cusp of an election. So the first thing he's going to have to do is to come forward and in many ways have a Zelensky moment to really affirm why the United States needs to continue to support Israel militarily, particularly after the huge fight we just saw over the emergency supplemental funding package to Israel. Netanyahu is being reminded that he can't take this relationship for granted. And the second thing he's going to really need to do is to lay out some kind of a vision for the day after Gaza, whether that's an immediate ceasefire or a long-term ceasefire, and then what comes after that. That's going to be the moment where he can really talk about it.
This plan centers around, of course, not just a ceasefire, but the resumption of an increase in supplying humanitarian aid to Gaza. I wonder your thoughts on this temporary pier that we've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and tens of millions of dollars into building. It's being repaired, apparently, after weather damage and will at some point be brought back in. Is this still part of the grand plan that the U.S. is offering?
I think that, again, as we've discussed on past calls, the humanitarian needs in Gaza are extensive, and each effort to administer aid is really just a drop in the bucket. We knew that there were going to be complications around the pier, not just the pier itself, which is having its own problems, but moving goods from that pier throughout the Gaza Strip to people who need it the most. That challenge will continue until there is a ceasefire. Certainly a ceasefire and a cessation of violence will make transporting goods through the Strip easier, but challenges will remain, including a lack of infrastructure, desperation, and other issues. So there are going to be no easy fixes to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, even during the ceasefire.
Well, if there's no easy fixes, Carmiel, how will we know? What metrics will we have to weigh whether or not that humanitarian aid aspect of the ceasefire deal has actually been completed or that adequate effort has been put in? How do you judge this?
Yeah, I think averting the most dire of circumstances, whether it's starvation or another health crisis, which is something that had been brewing but has thus far actually been averted, is something that will really help serve as an indicator. But we will see that aid move. Whether or not it's going to be enough and whether or not it's going to move quickly enough is going to continue to be a challenge. But I do think there is the prospect for an improvement.
All right, Carmiel Arbit of the Atlantic Council, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Now, coming up, we'll turn to our political panel as we look at the retribution plans that congressional Republicans have in response to the felony conviction of Donald Trump last week. More next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Former President Donald Trump and the RNC raked in a massive $141 million haul in May, according to his campaign, which says 25% of donors last month were new. And tens of millions of that came, of course, after his felony conviction last week. Joining us now is our political panel, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So, Rick, obviously, we won't know how this changed votes realistically for sure until November, but we already know how it's changing the movement of money. If 25% of the donors in May were new, that's a pretty good sign for Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's new money coming into your campaign. New donors is a very healthy sign. It shows kind of that voters are looking his way and saying, I'm willing to place a bet. Some donors, they like to go after someone they think is going to win. So there's probably a little bit of the he's going to win and I want to be in. That rhymes. And so I wouldn't discount that, including the big donors, right? So many of these big Republican donors tend to sit on the sidelines so they know who's going to be the nominee or who's going to win the election, and then they start piling on. And I think you're starting to see a real movement in that regard, too. So big numbers for Donald Trump is going to change the narrative, certainly this week, based on what was a horrific week last week on the legal front.
Big numbers indeed. $141 million for Trump and the RNC, Jeannie, in the month. $52.8 million was the 24-hour period following the verdict. And to Kaylee's point, 25% new donors on the month, 30% were new just in that pocket of time following the verdict. What's the takeaway for Joe Biden here? What's the lesson for the Biden campaign?
Yeah, and those numbers don't even include the soft money, which can potentially be a lot of big money. We do know last week Donald Trump, even the night of the conviction, went out with some big donors for dinner, and he did that every night. So he probably has raked in an enormous amount, more than we even know today. For the Biden campaign, it really means that they have to keep moving along where they were in terms of money. They were doing fairly well with money. This is a race that's going to be fought in these 6 to 7 swing states, so the operation on the ground is critical. They've set up a number of offices. But I think as it pertains to the conviction itself, there's a huge debate in the Democratic Party. How tough should Joe Biden go against Donald Trump on this? And I think you're looking at these numbers in terms of the money. You're looking at the polls, which haven't moved much, at least since the conviction on Thursday night. And I think Joe Biden has to be aggressive, because if he is not, this threatens to get away from them. And so I think they're going to have to ensure that he and his surrogates are aggressive on the fact that Donald Trump is a convicted felon.
So, Jeannie, you speak about debate over this within the Democratic Party. It doesn't seem that there is all too much debate within the Republican Party. Mostly everybody is sticking to the party line about this having been rigged from the start, how this is unfair for former President Donald Trump. Even those who are very on the margins trying to stray away from that, including Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, who's running to flip a blue Senate seat red, who just said, hey, you got to respect the verdict and the way the justice system played out, is now getting kind of villainized by the RNC, or at least the co-chair, Lara Trump. What do you make of that, Jeannie?
Yeah, they are circling the wagons for sure. We've seen it. You know, the Larry Hogan instance was quite remarkable, because the astonishing thing he said, as you just mentioned, was respect the decision, basically. And he was hit back by Lara Trump. He was hit back by Chris Lasavita. I mean, they are clearly trying to make sure that there is no sort of room for any Republican of note to try to criticize Donald Trump on this. So they are clearly circling the wagons, because they know that this is a negative for anybody running for president to be a convicted felon. And they don't have to look far to acknowledge that. 3 days before the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump himself said of Hillary Clinton, a convicted felon running for office or being president will grind this government to a halt. You can't let it happen. Of course, he meant in the case of her, and now the shoe is on the other foot, and they know that as well. So they're trying to ensure that Republicans know they have to stay in line on this.
Well, we've had a couple of interesting, I guess, examples of fallout here. The Lara Trump comment about Larry Hogan is one of them. We're also seeing this manifest itself on Capitol Hill now that lawmakers are coming back. Marjorie Taylor Greene's got this defund New York movement that I'm guessing we shouldn't pay too much attention to, Rick. But Mike Lee has a pretty significant roadblock that he's setting up in the Senate right now. Basically, anything that's coming out of this White House is DOA, including judicial nominations. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, we're showing you that letter that Mike Lee co-signed with some of his colleagues. This is, I guess, maybe a more real side effect of the Trump verdict. But this idea of Republican retribution in Washington equals what in this Congress?
Well, I do think we have to understand that things would be grinding to a halt anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is now an election season. It's official. There's really no must-pass legislation. So everyone's going to be playing these kind of messaging games. And obviously, you know, not letting any further confirmations of federal judges would be standard operating practice. But putting it in the context of, you know, former president was just convicted of 34 felonies is pretty substantial. So,
state court.
So everything is in that light these days. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's worth paying attention to. Anybody who thought they were going to try and find something to get done in Congress between now and Election Day, forget about it. Anything that is a roadblock is probably going to be put in the light of, oh, Republicans rallying around Donald Trump. And by the way, Republicans would have expected to rally around Donald Trump. We saw, you know, back in, you know, February of, 23, when the indictments started, that Donald Trump was at his lowest ebb. I mean, he was losing to Ron DeSantis in primary numbers, right, as far as polling goes. And then all of a sudden, one indictment, rally around Donald Trump. Yeah. Two indictments, rally around Donald Trump. So we've seen this act before. It'll play out the rest of the summer. Summer's kind of the dead spot in primaries right now. And all attention is going to start to focus on this debate at the end of June.
But at the end of the summer, Rick, quickly is September, and September 30th, a funding deadline, a fresh one, considering we just basically figured out 2024, this fiscal year appropriations. Jim Jordan, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, today submitted legislative proposals to defund what he calls lawfare by Jack Smith, Fani Willis, Alvin Bragg, Letitia James. Is this actually going to be the government shutdown battle, is whether or not these special counsels or those looking into Trump can get funded? Is that actually the legislative consequence of all of this?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think you can anticipate a government shutdown battle because this is a Congress that's going to be very highly politicized. And other than the National Defense Authorization Act that is nicely making its way through the Senate and the House, everything else is basically being put on hold. So it's not like anybody else is rushing to get to a deadline. The Senate and the House have not made a September spending deadline in a decade. So let's not hold our breath and think anything's going to derail that. It's already derailed long before these guys start this process.
Factory is closed. Coming up, a jury is selected in Hunter Biden's gun trial. Just beginning today, Rick and Jeannie will be back with us to talk about the implications next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think it's a strong case, and I think Hunter Biden's goose is cooked. The issue is, did he knowingly purchase a firearm while an abuser or user of a controlled substance? He was an abuser and a user. He bought the gun in 2019. He was already an abuser and user, as chronicled in his memoir, Beautiful Things, and on his laptop. Everyone knows it.
That was attorney Danny Karen on with us on the early edition of Balance of Power, talking about the Hunter Biden gun case, the trial now underway. The jury is selected, and back with us our political panel, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital, Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Good to see you both again. Jeannie, it's never good when Danny Karen says on TV that your goose is cooked. And I realize that's not a good day for Hunter Biden. But what does it matter politically for Joe Biden?
It is a very tough day for Joe Biden, and I think personally, obviously, the entire family more than anything. And we have seen them hugging Hunter Biden very, very close just over the last weekend, going to church together, biking, the First Lady in the courtroom with him today. This is very tough for them. You know, Hunter Biden is an admitted addict. He was in recovery at the time of this purchase. I think the attorney is absolutely right. There is probably a good deal of evidence for them to get him convicted on this. And I think the president is feeling like any parent would about this. As he said, I'm a parent. I'm a father. I love my son. I support him completely. I'm also president. And so he's going to continue to watch this very carefully. But I do believe Hunter Biden, unless the defense is able to find a way to show that he didn't check that box, is going to probably be convicted of these charges. It's very difficult to imagine there's a way around this legally.
Rick, obviously there's some differences here between this trial and the trial of Donald Trump, one being that Hunter Biden is not running for any kind of elected office right now. He is the son of the president, not trying to be one himself. But does this make it harder for President Biden to cast so much attention toward Trump's conviction if his son could end up convicted of a felony as well?
Yeah, I think the Trump conviction just swarms over everything, right? I mean, it's the first time in history a former president's ever been convicted of a crime. There have been all kinds of ne'er-do-well sons and daughters and aunts and uncles of presidents who have done bad things, and nobody really remembers them or cares about it. So I think in the large scheme of things, by the time you roll around in November, I think the Hunter Biden thing will be a distraction. That being said, it does kind of freeze up things. I mean, here we are talking about it this week, right after a major, conviction of the president for these 34 counts. So it does kind of put a blanket over the campaign. And I would say this is the time of year, the summer, where voters kind of take a break. They're really not paying attention much to what's going on. So if you had a timetable, if you're the Democrats and Trump trying to say, when do I want to go out and get convicted of something, now's the time. And so the question is, how much do people really care about it? And I would doubt that this is going to have a big impact. But this election will be on such small margins, 100,000 people, 50,000 people, 25,000, that it really doesn't take much to have an impact on this election right now.
Yeah. We just have a minute, Jeannie. You mentioned the personal trial that this is for the Biden family. We saw the First Lady in the courtroom today. To the extent that Joe and Jill Biden stick with their son, is that not something that voters would reward?
You know, I don't know if they will reward it, but I do think that they will see Joe Biden and the First Lady as very human. So many of us know people who have struggled with addiction. This is very, very difficult. And, you know, Joe Biden has made that case. So I think people will see the human side of him.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature political panel, thank you so much. And of course, for more coverage of the Hunter Biden trial and other stories you need to pay attention to in the political universe, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.